Hello, and a very warm welcome here from Zurich, or precisely from Volkerswil, close to Zurich. My name is Kai Landwehr. I'm Director of Marketing at myclimate Foundation, and I have the pleasure and the honor of being your host for this cloud talk. How useful are afforestation projects today? So my role is a pretty simple one because I have to start and to guide a discussion of two fantastic forestry experts talking you through projects and to the overall role of forestry. But before we start into this discussion and before I introduce these two experts, I would like to provide you in the audience with some information. So first, we want to do a kind of an interactive talk. So yes, you can lay back and just listen and enjoy to our talk, but you could also provide us with some information about you and with some guidance for the talk. Therefore, we have prepared a live poll on menti.com. So I don't know if you have ever worked with this software, but no worries at all. It is super simple. I would like to ask you to open a second tab on your browser or take your mobile device, go to the web page www.menti.com and type in the code, or just use this QR code you can see on this screen here. I hope you can see it, because I don't see it right now. Okay, here we go. There's the QR code, so you can just scan the QR code, or you go to the web page and scan this code. Then you will see the first question, tick your answer, push the submit button, and then you see a second question. Please respond to this question as well, and push the submit button. Thank you so much. We have also reserved some time, probably at the end of our talk today, for a live Q&A with you. You have a chat button here on your software, so just type in any pressing questions you have and send it over to us. We try to respond to all of them today. If we can't manage today, please be sure that we will answer them later on. So the talk for today is planned for 60 minutes. But we don't have any kind of sharp end. However, so I need to hurry up, but one last and final information for you. So this cloud talk will be recorded and will be uploaded on the myclimate webpage, www.myclimate.org, and then you have to find the event webpage later on, but we will also send you an after-event communication. Okay, after this brief, let's say virtual kind of housekeeping, so let me bridge to our topic today, to the topic of forestry. So isn't it a good idea planting trees or preserving existing forest ecosystems and to help the climate, to work on global biodiversity, etc. pp? So my answer would have been a clear yes. And a little spoiler, it still is. But maybe you have heard recently or have read articles in media, articles who are pretty, let's say, harsh, criticizing projects, questioning the impact or the integrity of projects and maybe of the system of global forestry itself. So maybe that is the reason why you joined our call or our talk here today, or maybe even worse, you have supported or are still supporting these projects and now you are confused and now you feel insecure. So that's the reason why we want to talk today about forestry, give you background information, and we do this together with our great experts. One of them standing next to me, my colleague Silvana Comino. She is our project manager, nature-based solutions at myclimate. Hi, Silvana.
Good afternoon, good morning.
Yeah. Silvana, so please, could you introduce yourself and could you tell us a bit more about your career path and how did you become the internal and maybe beyond expert at myclimate for forestry?
Well, greetings again. I'm very happy to hear and to see that so many of you are participating in this great discussion about this important topic. Well, just a brief background. I was in my studies really interested in how can we channel international cooperation towards restoring landscapes, degraded landscapes, in a long-lasting way, which at the same time benefit the local communities, the indigenous community, the local communities. So I studied different, particularly at the agroforestry and reforestation level, I studied different projects, successful and less successful ones, in order to understand what are the key ingredients which make reforestation projects and in general landscape restoration projects long-lasting. And so I equipped my backpack with lessons learned and with tools, and then I went to the field. I've spent about 20 years in Latin America working in different reforestation projects in different roles, such as operational level project management, training, technical support, and also in different roles at the consultant level in feasibility studies, evaluation. And then after about 20 years, I went back to Europe, and I went for a walk in Switzerland close to the Aletsch Glacier, one of the biggest glaciers in the middle of Europe. And I was so appalled to see how much it receded. And instead of getting depressed, I decided I'm going to get active. And then in 2009, I started in myclimate. And at that time in myclimate, we were not engaged in the land use sector. We were only working at the renewable energy and energy efficiency level. And it was my mission to open up this project category also at myclimate. So I spent about 2 years convincing the management board that we should engage in the land use sector. And yeah, I think I leave it there for the next chapter.
Yeah, thank you, Silvana. Yeah, we will jump exactly to this part of the history a little later. But now I would like to hand on to the second guest of today, sitting in a country far, far away in the morning. Hey, good morning, Kahlil. This is Mr. Kahlil Baker, the CEO and founder of Taking Root. Hi, Kahlil.
Hi, good morning. You gave away my punchline. I'm Kahlil Baker. I'm a founder and CEO of Taking Root. But I guess for the purpose of this talk, my claim to fame is I designed the project in Nicaragua that we'll be talking about. Perhaps most importantly, I love trees. Trees are basically essential to life on Earth as we know it. And so I've dedicated my life to trying to find ways that we can get more trees, more forests on the planet. Thank you so much for giving me the platform to talk about trees.
Yeah, thank you, Kahlil. It's great having you here with us, or at least virtually here with us. So yeah, you mentioned the project. So yeah, we have all the time kind of a mixed up between Taking Root and Community, which is the name of the project. So please introduce the project to us and, more important, to our audience.
Yeah, for sure. At its simplest terms, the project in Nicaragua, which we call Community, is a project that grows trees with farmers. And it's based on a simple principle. It's a simple principle, but it's unfortunately often ignored. And that principle is that trees need to improve people's livelihoods. Unless trees are something that benefits people, I don't think they have much chance of succeeding. And so while we call ourselves a reforestation project, a lot of the emphasis we do is on improving livelihoods through growing trees. And so the way that works is that in the short run, we provide financial incentives for farmers that want to increase forest cover on their farms. And so they get these performance-based payments for growing trees. But the trees that we grow aren't just trees for the sake of growing trees, they're always trees in agroforestry or systems to improve livelihood. So in the longer term, we connect farmers to markets to create the ongoing value of growing trees. So in the short run, people are receiving direct cash payments to grow trees in productive ways on their farm. In the long term, we work on creating market access. Kai, I don't know if you're able to share some slides. I could sort of give a bit of a visual of some of the impact of the project and how it works.
Here is the one on the total program impact.
Yeah. So we started off in Nicaragua about 15 years ago, super small, working with a handful of farmers. And the real crux of the project was getting community buy-in. And as people started joining the project and generating more and more trust and appreciation for the project, more and more people started joining and started growing and growing and growing to the point where it's now the largest reforestation initiative in the country. and possibly the largest reforestation initiative in all of Central America. What's super cool about it is that while it's now a quite large reforestation project, it's actually made up of thousands of quite small parcels on different farmers' fields, growing entirely native species. And so we've managed to grow over 20 or close to 20 million trees on over 11,000 hectares with over 3,326 families. And these are actually information from last year, and the project has grown substantially since. And what this impact doesn't even mention is that in addition to like these direct benefits, it's a huge source of employment. And so collectively, we create over 5,000 jobs, seasonal jobs per year, in addition to the hundreds of full-time jobs of it. So it's having a tremendous impact, both in terms of like getting a lot of money into people's hands, creating a lot of jobs, and creating a lot of forest cover of diverse native tree species of different ages. Perhaps if you go to the next slide, I can speak really briefly to how the project works. I'm sorry, this was the one on employment.
This is just for employment.
But if you go to the following slide, yeah, how it's sort of structured. And so Taking Root is the project developer. And to be able to do this as efficiently as possible at scale, we sort of work in a hub at intersection between two partners. And so myclimate, who is with here today, does, well, they'll speak to a lot about what they do, but creates a lot of that market access through finding partners. The project is then certified through the Plan Vivo standard that oversees, they're like a third-party certifier to go ensure that the impacts are true and that we're following best practices. And the supply side, we work through our longtime implementation partner, Afforestation, who connects us to the thousands of farmers. And so money essentially flows from the far right of the screen through myclimate all the way to farmers, with the majority of the funds going directly into cash payments towards farmers as the trees successfully grow. I'm sure we'll speak more based on what people are interested in, but this is a general overview of how the program works and is structured.
Super, yeah. Thank you so much. So you've mentioned the farmers you're working with, and you've also sent us before a very short video, not only with beautiful pictures from Nicaragua and from the project region, but also pictures with statements from the farmers showing their motivation. And I think in German, I would say film up. So to the guys behind the camera, could you show us this short video, please?
La naturaleza del mismo árbol, pues, ¿verdad? Porque eso es algo que nosotros a veces no lo reconocemos, pues, y lo pasamos por desapercibido, y lo que hacemos es montarle el machete, el hacha a las plantas, y no sabemos el daño que estamos haciendo.
Eso iba de paso. Aquí no valía que hubiera una montaña, le pegaba fuego directo y eso se perdía, se quemaba y luego se quitó todo. Desde que comenzamos a cultivar, quedamos sin árboles, pero a la hora que iban creciendo, esto se puso bueno.
Es importante la reforestación porque nos sirve para tantas cosas, oxígeno, digamos, lo maderable.
El árbol me da sombra, la fertilidad en la tierra.
Mantener pues las otras plantaciones que tengo de maíz, de frijoles.
Que hay más animalitos, hay más pájaros.
Ahora es abundante el agua en el pozo.
La temperatura.
Ya tengo esta entrada también de dinero.
Me siento alegre porque yo siento de entrar al bosque.
Y cuando yo estaba sembrando esta madera, me decían, no, está tonteando usted, ya no lo va a lograr. Ya está bien. ¿Qué beneficio va a sacar? Yo tengo hijos, tengo nietos. Y no lo logro yo, lo logran ellos, pues.
Yeah, perfect. I think this video shows pretty clearly so what could have been the problem, deforestation, but also what is the solution and what is the project doing good for the people. Before we jump into this project, so yeah, I have you, Kahlil, you're the founder, and I think every founder has its own story. So how did it come that I think years ago, a pretty young guy from Canada came to Nicaragua and started a project like this?
Yeah. It's people's stories are always funny. You never know what life is going to bring. I moved to Nicaragua when I was 18 years old, and I was living there actually with a family in the same region of the country where the project started and continues to operate. And I was living with a family, and I just fell in love. I fell in love with the people, with the culture. Ended up living there. This was not a job. This was just a life passion initially. But to make money, I would go back to Canada in the summer times and work as a tree planter. Canada has one of the biggest silviculture or tree growing industries in the world, and I worked as a tree planter. And initially, I felt like being a tree planter was a great thing. I could earn a livelihood. It was hard work, but I could earn a livelihood. And I slowly realized that if I didn't do this work, someone else would, right? Like if I quit and I stop planting trees, it doesn't matter. Someone else will go back and grow trees. And what was important was that we had a system in place in Canada that created funding, that created a model that enabled reforestation. And so while I felt good about my work, I was in a sense just a cog in the wheel. And what was important is that there was a system in place to maintain and restore forests. And I thought back about my time in Nicaragua, where I'd go there, and a lot of what we do was when I was helping out in the farms, we'd clear land, grow food, and I started realizing, hey, I feel like people talk about the benefits of trees, farmers themselves talk about trees, but people aren't growing trees. Why isn't this the case? And I realized what was critical was be able to build a system in place. And so that then sort of became my life passion, my life dedication of trying to figure out how do I create a system that enables people to grow trees. And so it became sort of two critical ingredients. Number one, people need to want to grow trees. And so the way to make sure that you want to make sure people want to grow trees is you ask them, hey, what would you like to do? And people talk about it. And the other one was, how do we get money for this? How do we get funding? How do we build a system in place? And so first I just started asking people for money. I said, hey, give me some money. Let me grow some trees with my friends, with my partners over here. And that was pretty tough. And at the time, someone said to me, no, Kahlil, the real thing is climate. Trees about climate. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And I started reaching out to people. And actually, that's how I met Silvana. And Silvana has been an amazing supporter through myclimate from the beginning around helping to create this system that channels funding towards growing trees in a way that people actually want to grow them. And so this has essentially become my life story, the story of taking root, and the story of our partnership with myclimate.
Yeah, and also a perfect bridge for me as the host, because you mentioned it. So Silvana, when did you learn first about the project, and how long did it take you to convince the people at myclimate at that time that this is a project worth to support and worth to be integrated in our portfolio?
Well, as I mentioned before, when I joined myclimate, there was basically no interest in land use and forestry activities, because there were still a couple of big questions, like the question of permanence. And so I did design a strategy where I looked at what existing standards are there in the market. At that time, there were not many standards in the land use sector. Gold standard wasn't engaged yet. There was the VCS, that at that time it was called the voluntary carbon standard. There was the CAR, the Carbon Action Registry, and there was Plan Vivo. And so I analyzed the different standards and looked at the pros and cons, and it was totally clear that the design of the Plan Vivo standard was in line with our requirements as myclimate. And it was also the oldest standard in the land use sector, and it was the only standard especially designed to tailor the interests of local communities and indigenous communities. And so that's where I dived a little bit deeper into the Plan Vivo system. I went to the meetings of Plan Vivo, and that's where I met Kahlil, and he gave a presentation on his project. And then I went to visit the project. At that time, when I went there were 80 farmers participating on about 150 hectares. And in the meantime, also the big question I had to convince the critical question within myclimate, the permanence ghost, the permanence elephant in the room. And at that time, the standards had developed a system to basically have a risk buffer to pool carbon credits from each project between 10 and 30% of certificates and put it in a global pool. So if in case there was a fire or there was a tropical storm or some dropouts, there was this pooled joint buffer from where you can retire these credits. And so this was a system which gave the buyer a guarantee that he will get this climate contribution.
Yeah, Thank you so much. Okay, so I think we have set the ground for the following talk to dive deeper into the projects. But maybe before we do this, so just let's have a brief check on our Menti polls. So if I can see the slide here, the first one with the results. There we go. So this is the current attitude of the audience. Yeah, and as we can see, okay, there are a couple of you who have at least questions. Some of you also have concerns, okay? That's very good to know. That helps us a lot. And secondly, so which are the topics that interest you the most? Okay, so this is about, it is about the difficulties, but it's about forestry itself and also about myclimate. Okay, that's good. So I think we can start right now. Or we have already started, but let's start on the biggest level with the real big picture. So now I have to take my card because I mentioned it at the beginning. So it seems like a very good idea to plant trees to grow a project like that. But at the same time, so I heard about Mr. Bill Gates, who said at the Climate Week in New York, so I quote him right now, planting trees as a key solution for tackling climate change was complete nonsense. And that view must be held by idiots, not science people. So, Silvana, Kahlil, carte blanche for you. So, what do you think? What is right and who is wrong? Maybe, would you like to start, Silvana?
Well, my first reaction was that maybe he has some shares in the technical carbon removal section, that maybe he thinks there's more money to be gained by supporting technical solutions than nature-based solutions. That was sort of my first thought when I read about this. And then I also thought, wow, is he really discrediting all the scientists from the IPCC and the whole UNFCCC process? Is he criticizing the Paris Agreement? Is he criticizing the Montreal Agreement? So does he go totally against all the science? That's it's a pretty daring statement.
Yeah, I would agree. Is there something to add from your side, Kahlil?
Yeah, I mean,
I guess so.
A couple of things. First, I think intuitively, I think we all know that nature is fundamental to climate and life on Earth. I don't think anyone thinks that if we destroy all of the world's forests, that we will be okay. I think we all know that fundamentally. When I heard that quote, I look into it, and I think it's also a bit of context that's missing. What I believe he was speaking to at that time was this idea that trees could be a substitute for other solutions, right? We're not going to fix climate change without stopping the use of so many fossil fuels, of putting so much carbon into the air. And there's been people who have proposed the idea that, look, don't worry, we don't have to stop polluting, we can just grow trees. And that's nonsense. That is complete nonsense. And that is the part where I think, are we forgetting about the science? And that's what I think it was referring to. It's also nonsense to think that forests, the loss of the world's forests, haven't been one of the largest contributors to climate change, and that there's no way possibly that we can get out of this problem without addressing this, restoring the world's forests. So I think it's the context there that was a bit missing.
Okay, then coming to the positive side. So Silvana, so what is the relevance? What is the role forestry has to play on a global scale if we want to fight successfully climate change?
Well, maybe we can look at the slide very briefly.
Not that one, that one.
Okay, one, then afterwards the second one. Well, it is very clear that without the natural climate solutions, we cannot comply with the Paris Agreement. We will see that afterwards also, and that the latest IPCC assessment report also stated that up to a third of the global emission reduction can be covered by natural climate solution. So we need to invest all the efforts in all the realms, in avoiding deforestation and further land degradation, restoring degraded ecosystems through reforestation activities, and also in the agricultural area, there are many opportunities to reduce emissions. And maybe show the next slide.
Yes.
While we are already at the latest report, this is the latest AR6 report, and then we can see actually that within the 5 most effective strategies, 3 of them come from the land use and forestry area, or from the AFFLU area. In the first, if we just focus on the second square, then we see in the first place we have avoiding deforestation and degrading existing ecosystems, and the second place would be the farmland to restore agricultural areas and improve soil management activities, and the third one would be restoring the degraded areas through reforestation activities. So it is absolutely detrimental that we engage in all the different types of forest-based activities or nature-based activities.
Okay, so just to put it simply, without the AFFLU sector, there's no chance of reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement.
And maybe complementary, if we don't just focus on climate, we also have to mention that we are facing a triple crisis. We also are facing a biodiversity crisis. And so, as you remember, last December, there was also the agreement signed on the global framework, biodiversity framework, and it's an intertwined problem. We can restore and we can resolve when we tackle them both. And also, triple crisis is also the social disparities that we have solutions where we can resolve all 3 crises, preventing a social disaster with lots of migration problems, and at the same time restoring some of the biodiversity issues we're facing, and at the same time the co-benefit would be the climate challenge.
Okay, so working in the AFFLU sector is even more important, but you have to done this properly and correctly. So when looking to the project side, so Kahlil, let's start with a maybe stupid question. So is there a difference, or what is the difference between planting a tree or growing and maintaining or even managing a forest?
Yeah, no, that is a simple question, but such an important question, and unfortunately one that's been so often missed. If we're talking about growing trees for improving livelihoods, for growing trees for mitigating climate change and creating ecosystems to support biodiversity, like Silvana was talking about, it goes without saying that those things are not addressed by planting a tree, they're addressed by having forests, right? And people often think, partially rightfully so, that to get a forest, you need to plant a tree. And that's absolutely correct. And so we need to grow trees. They can regenerate naturally, or we can plant them. And that's an important step in the journey to having a forest. But it's a complete mistake to think that that is the destination. And if it was as easy as planting trees, we wouldn't have this problem in the first place, right? If we just need to plant trees, this would be a very easy problem to address. The problem is we've been clearing forests because in many cases, it works out better for people to get rid of trees than to plant them. And that's why we're in the problem. So unless you address the situation where you create a context where people actually want to grow trees, planting trees is going to be a short-lived solution. And so because this little detail is missed, so many projects and so many focus has been on the planting of the tree. And as a result, as a sad result of it, there's so many cases in the media around the world where you've got these large failed tree planting projects. And the problem is they were not failed. They were very successful in planting trees. They were failed in the sense that they didn't create forests. And so you have to take the perspective, what do we need to create forests, and work backwards from there, and not the perspective, what does it take to plant trees?
So yeah, and for doing this, so you have to work together with the people there, with the local communities. So you said that you have kind of performance-based payments for the people, so you provide economic benefits. So could you tell us a bit more, describe how this is gonna work in the beginning, when you have the phase of tree planting, but also afterwards, after a couple of years?
Yeah, absolutely. And so just before going into the specifics, just reminding the general context, right? People love growing trees when it improves their livelihoods. And so the context that we're in is improving livelihoods. So we say we don't plant trees, we grow them, but we don't just grow trees, we create the context for improving livelihoods. And when people want to grow trees, there's a pretty good chance that they'll successfully grow trees. And so then you have to ask yourself, what do we need for people? What context is there in that's stopping people from growing trees? If they want trees, why are they not doing it in the first place? What are the barriers to people growing trees? And the answer to that question is context specific, right? So it's not going to be the same answer everywhere, but it's the same question everywhere. If people want to grow trees, what's stopping them from doing it in the first place? And the context that we operate in, there's been two big factors that inhibit people from being able to grow trees. One of them is people complain that there's not great market access. So that if they grow trees, well, then those trees it's hard to get them to provide value. And there's a bunch of market access problems. But the other thing is, it's a pretty long-term investment. And so people often struggle with making the investments necessary to be able to do that. And so our program is designed to sort of remove those two barriers that help overcome the investment cost of growing trees and then creating market access. So that's why in the short run, we do these performance-based payments. So we say, hey, if you want to grow trees, that's amazing. We'll help you cover some of those costs. And then we create these performance-based payments. So if people actually want to grow trees, they'll get this cash payment. They'll help them overcome some of those costs and provide an important source of cash, of income to their income. Eventually, as the trees grow, there's the next barrier. Okay, well, I didn't grow trees just for the sake of growing trees. I grew trees to improve overall farm productivity. So how do I get these trees to create market value? And so that depends on the trees that are being grown. But in some cases, it's access to coffee markets. So people are growing coffee underneath. You can imagine this being done with other crops like cacao. In Latin America, people have a lot of cattle. And so trees are grown in silvopastoral systems, so intermixed with cattle to support cattle and milk production and help market access there, and sometimes even timber markets themselves. When you grow trees at a high density, they start crowding each other out. And although I know it sounds counterintuitive, thinning or removing some of those trees is actually the best thing for carbon sequestration. And so that creates new products that people can then bring to market, and we help create that market access.
Okay, so this is a rather complex system. It is a long time system, but then you have also, let's say, these other levels. So what is the impact for the climate? So how do you monitor and how do you calculate and also verify that there is a long-time storage of carbon through this project?
Absolutely. Contrary to what is sometimes portrayed, measuring carbon in trees can actually be done accurately. In fact, you can just measure the trees and get those carbon estimates. And so in our systems, we measure the trees on periodic basis at regular intervals to measure the carbon that's being sequestered over time. The relationship is pretty straightforward. 1 kilo of wood, when it's dried, is about a half kilo of carbon by weight. So if you know the relationship between the volume of the tree and its weight, by measuring the tree, you get to its volume, and by getting to its volume, you can get to its weight, and by the weight, you get to the carbon. And so we have these systems in place that every single parcel that we grow is systematically monitored. So we go there, we send field technicians in there, we measure all the trees. Those are then converted into carbon numbers, and those are then reported. We then have internal verification teams that go check that work is being done, and then there's third-party auditors, kind of like how a company would go through a financial audit. We go through the regular carbon audits, where people go then double-check the measurements, double-check the math and the calculations, and that's how you go and quantify the amount of carbon that's being stored in trees. There are plenty of techniques out there. A lot of people do it with remote sensing, satellite imagery. There's been a lot of progress in the world with that. It's important to say, though, that those are often less accurate. They're lower cost, but they tend to be less accurate than just measuring stuff in the field. And so at Taking the Root, we are first and foremost doing what's called field inventory. So we go and measure the trees.
Okay, so sounds like a lot of work, and you also sent us some pictures or an interactive graph showing what is really done there on ground. So we will start this short movie right now, and maybe you can talk over and tell us what we see there. So could you start the movie, please? Thanks.
Great. So the first step when farmers join the program is that we map the polygon, the area where it's being reforested, and create these sampling plots, which are those circles that were shown on the map. And then teams go on a periodic basis to those circles with a fixed radius rope, and they go and measure every single tree within the parcel, and they take a photograph of it. So they'll enter the species of the tree, they'll enter its diameter, and because we're using an app, we're also recording the geolocation and the identity of the technician, so that it's completely auditable. And so this is the input data, which is then transformed into carbon numbers. As I was mentioning earlier, the math and how those carbon numbers are done is audited, desk review, where certifiers go through and make sure that the math and the calculations are all well. And then that team that you saw is actually an independent auditing team that's within our own company. But then that is then third-party verified by these external auditors and the carbon standard, and in many cases, the clients themselves. And so there's actually a number of layers of controls of how this is all being measured and audited.
Yeah, and the result at the end are carbon credits, certified carbon reduction emissions or captured carbon. So, and we at myclimate, so we market them. So, and this is one of your tasks, Silvana. So when working together, when partnering with a project developer, so how do you do it? So how important, let's say, is the level of trust? And how important are, let's say, anything connected with control?
Well, before we take a project in our portfolio, we go through a very rigorous due diligence process. We have two different due diligence, initial due diligence process, where you in the first place look, is this project even eligible according to our strict selection criteria? And then if it passes the first round, then we do a very extensive due diligence, including a visit of the project. And what do we look at in this due diligence process? We look, for instance, the project partner. What qualifications does the project partner have? Does he have experience, for instance? How long has he been working with the local community? Does he have experience with monitoring activities? Does he have a good relationship with the government, the local government authorities, with the national government? And then we look at also the project design. Is it based on a theory of change? What happens after the 10 years when the payment for ecosystem services stop? What incentives will prevail for the farmers to continue keeping the forest? Then we look at the country level, the security, what are the corruption indexes, what is the regulatory framework in terms of the carbon market. So and then also, of course, we look at the community level. Has there been FPIC, the free prior informed consent? Are they really involved in the design of the project, the decision making of the project? Is there an empowerment of the local communities and also of the implementing partner that they can learn to manage the project in the future without external support? So there's and then also the financial perspective. There's a lot of indicators which we consider before we take the final decision to include the project in our portfolio. And of course, the question of trust versus control. Trust is something you build over the years, as in the case of community trees. We have been building this this trust over the last 13 years. And of course, the monitoring and the results of the project is part of building that trust.
And there is another player in this game. So you have mentioned it. So this project is following the Plan Vivo standard. So maybe you, Silvana, can also tell us a bit more about the Plan Vivo standard, and then I will hand it over to you, Kahlil, and ask you, why did you decide to build your projects following the rules or the requirements of the Plan Vivo standard?
Well, the specialty of the Plan Vivo standard is that it is based, as Kahlil very eloquently already explained, on the livelihood benefits of the farmer. Of course, the farmer will only participate if there are some financial incentives in place, long-term, short-term, medium, and long-term financial incentives. And the Plan Vivo standard was explicitly developed to allow the local communities and indigenous communities to have access to the climate financial market. Most of the climate projects are related to foreign investments, and those farmer communities, they don't have access to foreign investors or to local banks. As you mentioned, they need quite a bit of upfront finance in order to wait till the first financial benefits come from their plantation. So they are dependent on some additional income streams. So that's exactly what the basis of the Plan Vivo standard was. And also another important component is a transparent benefit sharing system. It's the only standard who has a requirement that at least 60% of the carbon revenues go to the landowner, to the owner of the certificate. And this is very unique, and also they are looking for beyond carbon benefits. They look at, for instance, how to include landless farmers, the ones who don't have access to lands, how to also make benefits to the biodiversity improvements. So this is very unique to this standard.
Want something to add, Kahlil? So why did you decide to work together with Plan Vivo?
Yeah, maybe I can give our project developer's perspective, because Silvana's answer was perfect and very complete. When we did a review of the different carbon standards, we found that the foundational principle was missing with a lot of the carbon standards, and Plan Vivo inherently understood that because the standard was developed from the bottoms up, not the top down. I don't know if anyone in the audience here owns or manages any land. If you do, I'd ask you, how do you choose how to use your land, right? And that's a super important question, because if we're here to increase forest cover, it means we're going from land that has no forest cover to land that does have forest cover. And so the really important question is, why do you not currently have trees? If we want trees, we want to go from no trees to having trees. And I have never, ever, ever met a landowner who told me, the way I think about managing my land is I think, how can I sequester the most carbon? And whatever that answer is how I will use my land. I've never met that. The way people think about it, well, it varies from person to person, but generally speaking, they're like, how can I get the most value, the most benefit, the most joy from my land? And if I'm getting value, benefit, and joy in a way that also sequesters carbon, well, that's a good thing, right? And so the North Star is not how can I sequester the most carbon? The North Star is how can I get the most value, joy, improvements up to my life through the use of my land? And that's pretty much usually connected to livelihoods. And so if you take a livelihoods approach, carbon will follow. If you take a carbon first approach, there's a good chance that it won't be successful. And that, I think, is the foundation of the Plan Vivo standard. And that is inherently connected to our theory of change, of that you want to increase the world's forest, then you have to improve, people's livelihoods have to be improved from growing trees.
But yeah, could there be some kind of negative consequences? So could this be kind of a competition between growing trees on the one side and growing food on the other side? Well,
that's an additional unique characteristic of the Plan Vivo standard. Plan Vivo, it's a Spanish name, and it means like land use plans. There is a requirement which states that only farmers can participate who have enough land, so a portion of it can be used to reforest without eliminating or putting in danger their agricultural production for their livelihood, for their immediate livelihood needs. So a farmer who only has half a hectare or 1 hectare, he will not be allowed to reforest the whole hectare because he wouldn't have enough land. He wouldn't have no land left over to produce the beans and the corn. So the program looks together with the technician, goes and visits the farmer and looks at the whole farm and makes a land use map and decides together with the farmer how he wants to use his lands. And so he will only use unutilized portions of his land in order not to be in competition with the food production.
Okay, so we heard about the global role of forestry. We dove into the project and heard what is doing good for the local communities and for the environment. So however, I think looking at the time here, so there we have to talk about a bit of the FHCs, so the frequently heard criticism. And let's start with the question of permanence. So we touched on it briefly, but when talking about permanence, so the permanent storage of carbon, so we have timeframes of 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. So Kahlil, maybe you can give us a bit background on these timeframes and also say again, so how can you guarantee the permanence, the permanent storage of the carbon emissions?
Yeah, absolutely. So when people speak about carbon, they speak about the time frame, right? We emit carbon today. Are we taking out carbon today? If you have carbon sequestered in a tree, will it stay there for the long term? Because a tree can burn down. And so there's an obvious concern around how do we ensure that the carbon stays sequestered, captured as long as possible, because ultimately if it's going right back into the air, that's a problem. Now, because it's very easy to visualize a tree growing and thus it's sequestering carbon, it's equally easy to visualize a tree dying and that same carbon going back. And then people say, well, how do you ensure the permanence? How do you ensure that tree will never die? And I think that's the wrong way to look at it. Because I can actually absolutely guarantee something to everyone here and to the whole world. Every single tree will eventually die. Everything that is alive, by definition, dies. And so we need to stop pretending that our job is to not let things die. What we need to do is to ensure that forests stay forests and for the long run. Where I live, in one of the largest forests of the world, the Boreal Forest that goes around Canada and Russia, they call it the taiga over there, is millions and millions of years old, and every single tree in that forest has died. And what's fundamentally important is that we're creating a system that encourages sustained forest land use. When a forest is a healthy forest, trees die and trees come back, and it's an ongoing cycle, and that's the cycle of life. That is how life works. And so fundamentally, and this is why I go back to growing livelihoods, right? We don't plant trees, we grow trees. We don't just grow trees, we create livelihoods. And so if we're in a system where people inherently want trees on their land, they will get trees. They will see to it that they have trees. Those trees will die, a forest will replace itself. And so really it's about the long run. And that's why good projects focus on this component. We now have a 15-year track record of trees growing, and that's still not long enough. It will keep going, but I'm fully confident that trees are going to continue growing through this system. And so the general principle that enables this, as I was saying, is around livelihoods. If people want to have trees on the land, they will have trees on their land. If you design projects around the principle of what is stopping you from growing trees, then you get to much longer lived projects. Now, in addition to that, of course, as Silvana mentioned earlier, there are risk buffers to account for this. Good project design accounts for a percentage of failure. We have failures all the time, but it's so diversified over thousands and thousands of parcels that those failures are built into the system. And so on the cumulative, on the aggregate, we get these long-term carbon sequestration benefits. I personally don't like the use permanence because I think it brings us to trying to pretend that trees won't die. trees will die. What's important is that we get this long-term durability of the carbon that's sequestered. I would even argue that there's nothing that's permanent in this world. The only thing that's assured is that we are going to eventually die and perhaps pay taxes. But we can't think we're designing for a never-ending permanent system. Oil that's in the ground today could be extracted tomorrow. We want to make systems to ensure that people continuously don't extract oil. Forests that are alive today can be burnt down. We want to design systems that make it that we keep forests alive, and when they do occasionally die or burn down or cut down, that we have systems to replace them.
Yeah, okay, so you gave me a great word, because you say, okay, there's nothing is permanent in this world, so, but there's one famous saying, so there's at least one permanent thing, or one thing that lasts forever, and this is the stupidity of mankind, which brings me back again to Mr. Bill Gates and to his statement, because I think we should briefly touch on the question of, is there a competition between nature-based solutions, forestry projects, but also other projects, and the so-called technical-based solutions? So wouldn't it be a great idea if we have found a technique who could just soak up all the carbon, or the carbon we need, out of the atmosphere, pump it into the ground, and there it stays forever?
I'll take that one for sure. I think that there's two pieces to this question. It's a good one. It's an ongoing one. Let me answer it in two different ways. Number one, and I just say this and I will keep saying this, I think it's completely false to put the land use sector, nature, against the energy sector, right? Absolutely. Like, we need to stop polluting. We need to stop burning fossil fuels. We need to stop putting carbon into the atmosphere, or putting so much carbon in the atmosphere. And a lot of that comes from using energy from burning fossil fuels. And if fossil fuels didn't emit carbon, maybe they wouldn't be such a problem. It's this idea that if we make a machine to suck that out, we can remove it. And that's great, right? That's great. But you cannot think of it as, oh, well, that's because we do that, we don't have to take care of nature. Because I guarantee you, destroy nature, you will still have climate change, right? Like, trees sequester carbon. Yeah, that's an important function of carbon, but they do so much more. They create winds, they create rain, remove all of that, and you're still going to have climate change. And so, we cannot say the land use sector is against the energy sector. The energy sector is critical, and the nature sector is critical. These are not enemies. That is my main argument. You can't pit them against them. But the second one is, nature is absolutely essential to climate. And even if we made perfect machines that could somehow do this cost effectively at scale, and we could remove all the carbon out of the air, but destroyed nature and got rid of the world's forests, this would not solve the problem. I guarantee it. Get rid of forests, get rid of nature, and we will have climate change, even if you have the machines. So this is not a if or, it's we need both. We need the land use sector, and we need to work in the energy sector. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. So before we open up these discussions to questions from the audience, I have one final question, or the pre-final question for both of you, because with all the media coverage we talked about before, so, and seeing you both feeling personally attached to the topic, to the project itself, so how do you feel as a person, not as an employee of myclimate or not the finder of taking root? So how do you feel when reading all these articles, maybe day by day? So are you too sensitive, or does it really touch you? So maybe Silvana.
Well, I think I wish that the social psychology of reporting on negative news would change, and some of the reporters would maybe help their readers to not just get excited about negative views or negative news, but rather would also really enjoy receiving seeds of hope, of positive examples, how we can make a difference, how we can still turn the wheel around. And I think here the reporters also have like a social responsibility to also document positive examples, inspiring examples, being motivating examples. And personally, I think if I think we need to do everything we can, and negative press like this is just a further encouragement to go ahead and make a bigger effort to report on positive examples like we are doing today, and showcasing best practice examples and motivating other investors and supporters to help expand those proof of concepts.
Anything to add from your side, Kahlil?
Yeah, I mean, of course, when I read about these things, it can be very disheartening, hurtful, especially when they sort of attack the intrinsic motivation of people like ourselves who've sort of dedicated our lives towards this, and somehow try and paint us as like scam artists. That is for sure the most frustrating and hurtful part of it. But I really agree with what Silvana said. And in many ways, it's galvanizing to be able to focus us on doing more and a source of motivation. Sorry, what was I trying to structure my thoughts? There's been an ongoing sort of varying debate over the last 15 years that I've been working in this space. And sometimes people go back to like, are forests good? Are forests bad? And there's so much, you know, wrong impression. Sometimes people are like, hey, trees can do everything. We don't even have to stop polluting. We can just grow trees and solve everything. Yay, 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 trees. And that's not right, right? But it's also not right to say like, hey, nature is not important to climate change. And so we kind of go through these overall sort of up and down cycles. And I see it as in many ways like our role to get the message out there, and people to not overestimate and say, hey, forests are important, but we don't have to worry about stopping pollution, but rather we have to stop emitting fossil fuels, and we have to do forests. I think in the industry that we're in, there were a lot of bad examples out there, and ultimately for what we're doing to work, society has to trust it, right? If there isn't that trust, then it's never going to work. And we need to build a system that builds trust. With all of this, these bad examples, we did have to get rid of like the bad projects that weren't really doing things, and that was an important part of building long-term trust in this system. So in the long run, this is a good thing. I just think we're going through a bit of a down cycle right now, where things are being sort of blown out of proportion, and giving the impression that somehow restoring nature is a bad thing. And so while this is hurtful in the short run, I do think long term it's essential to rebuilding trust in this industry, and creating a better system.
Super. Thank you so much. So the time is running, time is flying. However, so I decided spontaneously to prolong this talk for some more minutes, because we have interesting questions in the chat, and I will start with one. So I look into the chat. So there's a question from Professor Martina Shakir, I hope I pronounced it more or less correct, from the University of Heilbronn. So we shortened the question, I read it, and then maybe you both can answer it. So we are not improving the climate just by offsetting carbon through tree growing. We must bring down absolute emissions. So why not focus on afforestation project in the wealthy countries that cause most emissions? So why not, Silvana?
Well, I think this is already, Kahlil already answered this. He already mentioned that we need to do everything. We need to keep the fossils in the ground. We need to keep all the oil in the ground. We need to reduce fossil fuel emissions and at the same time increase our nature-based solutions. And the second question about why not doing reforestation projects in the countries where you have the highest emissions. Yes, I think, Kahlil, you can answer that very well, but the simple answer is that the forest carbon development implementation costs in the affluent countries like ours are much higher than in less income countries. A, and B, particularly in the forest belt, the carbon sequestration rate per hectare is much higher than in the boreal region. Kahlil, you please add if you have something additional to add.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. There's, again, we don't want to create these ideas of like this or that, right? Forests in developed countries like Switzerland are super important. Forests in less developed countries are also super important. But if we look at land use sector as a whole, and we look at the world's forests, and we look at where are we losing the most forests, and we use that, and we think of forests as a forest as an entity, you will find that the areas where there's the greatest loss of forest and thus the greatest potential of restoring and preventing that is in areas where that takes place, and that happens to take place primarily at this time in society in equatorial regions.
Super, thank you so much. There is another question. I think this is directed to you, Kahlil. So, how do you monitor the planting? How do you make sure that the performance-based payment is only used for planting of trees and not covering other needs? This is a question from Leonie Meyer from FAO.
Cool. I feel like I got to unpack that question a little bit. And I do want to make sure we're not talking about this other part, is in we don't dictate how people are going to use their money, right? That becomes, I think, a completely perverse system. People get paid for performance, and then they can use that money how they see fit, how they can, manage their own lives, manage their own livelihoods. And so then we don't ensure that people don't use money for any other thing. They can use it for whatever they want. What we do ensure is that we're getting performance-based results, and so that people aren't getting paid if they're not hitting those targets. And so then the question becomes, how do you make sure that the work is actually getting done? And that is done in a very similar way to how we showed earlier on the video with the forest inventory, and even in greater detail. And so we have these teams that do these systematic forest inventories through those sampling plots that we saw, and you go measure and count everything and report, picture, audit, whatever. And that's how we then figure out if outcomes have been achieved. So if we say, hey, you had to hit 1,000 trees, this forest inventory is literally the counting of trees to say, hey, you've hit 1,000 trees. But it doesn't even just end there. Within there, we have what we call extension agents or community technicians, who their job is to help enable the farmers and support them to reach that goal. So it's not just, did you pass or fail? Sorry, as in we do everything we can to ensure farmers' success. And so farmers will receive continuous visits, sometimes during the planting season, sometimes daily visits even, to help them make their way towards planting those trees. And we're following literally by percentage of every single parcel until they hit completion. So we don't just measure to find out, hey, pass or fail. We're dedicated to people's success from the beginning. And so only when targets are met and audited do payments get received. Farmers then use those payments to do whatever they want. Sometimes it's to cover the cost of hiring their neighbors to help them plant those trees. Sometimes it's used for all sorts of things, buying food, medicine, sending their kids to school, whatever. We don't track how people spend their own money. I think that'd be a little bit too invasive.
Super. Then I have two more questions, the last questions from the chat, as I mentioned before. So all the other questions we will respond in a written form later on. But I think these two questions touch more or less the same topic. So there's the first one. You mentioned market access. Do you mean access to forest products? Parenthesis, wood, non-wood. And the second one is, how do you ensure that the planted trees are not going to be used by the wood industry?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, great. I love this stuff. Part one is market access is, yes, we mean so when we grow trees, we're not growing trees for just the sake of trees. Trees are always grown based on a process of what farmers want to grow to improve livelihoods. And so we have these different planting designs depending on the context. So in coffee regions, people tend to want to grow coffee agroforestry systems. In this case, market access is for the coffee. In cattle regions, people tend to want to grow trees with cattle, and so market access will be through the cattle or the milk products. In other cases, it's actually trees growing for wood, and so we're helping to ensure that the linkages are made between those value chains, whatever creates that value. So that is what we mean by market access, because it is critical that people benefit from having trees on their farm. If they're not benefiting from growing trees, they don't want to grow trees. And if they don't want to grow trees, then they cut them down, right? So it is really critical that people want to grow trees. So that's part one of the question. Part two is, how do we ensure that they don't go to the wood industry? we don't. In fact, contrarily, the wood industry is a great way, one of the many ways that people can have access to markets. I think the question that's really behind that is, how do you ensure that all the trees you plant aren't just being cut down so you don't have land use conversion, right? And that's the real crux of the whole thing, that longevity piece. And so the perspective taken is, how do you ensure a healthy forest? And you look at the land first, right, from livelihoods to land, and then work in function of that. So the trees are planted at a high density and require thinnings to grow bigger. And so all the parcels are certified under sustainable forest management, and management removing some of the trees in these plantations is essential to long-term growth. In fact, it's fascinating to see when you don't remove trees, the trees get all tightly packed and they don't grow as big. Healthy forests have tree removals. So then the question was, well, what does that wood get used for, right? So carbon was taken out of the air into the biomass, and where does that biomass go, and what's that net balance? And so then the different forest products that go have their own sort of carbon journeys which come into it. We have, at taking root, a big biochar production. And so actually, we're then transforming some of the trees into biochar, which is essentially just condensed carbon, and then returning it back into the soil. That is a forest product industry. And this is actually additional carbon that's not even part of the carbon quantification. So the trees are like pumps, removing carbon from the air. Overall, we're removing some of the trees. That's actually helping the land sequester more carbon on that unit of land. Well, the carbon from the removed trees, which is quote unquote temporary, is then processed into the wood sector, sometimes into long-term furniture, sometimes biochar, and a number of other things. So it's got its own sort of life cycle assessment.
Thank you so much.
So maybe just to summarize, trees are removed, and that's part of optimal carbon sequestration.
Super. Thank you so much. So we're already 7 minutes over the time. However, there is a last question, and there is a last question, and this question from the chat is a great one. I think we have to bring it on the table. So it's from Stefan Rother from Tropical Verde, and he's asking about the value of biodiversity. So how does a typical 20 years old regrown forest in Nicaragua look like in terms of diversity of species? And how do you deal with the natural tree loss, which can be quite high in the tropics, substitute, or trust in natural succession?
Yeah.
Very briefly, maybe.
Very briefly, yeah. So biodiversity is absolutely key. Silvana mentioned it right from the beginning. We plant only native tree species, as I said in the beginning, but we also try and encourage and let sort of nature do its things to the extent possible and accelerate natural succession. And so while we plant about 10 different tree species, we have over 100 different tree species recorded in our systems because of this natural regeneration that's encouraged within it. And natural succession, which is, we were saying earlier, there's a natural process in forests where trees grow and die and makes room for others. And so we sort of mimic some of that succession through the harvesting process and through the natural process. And so by having hundreds of different native tree species around areas that used to be non-forested that are now forested, that in itself, beyond the plant biodiversity, that's a host to other wildlife biodiversity. And so we can already see big influxes of wildlife that was actually quite often reported to be quite rare to be seen in the region coming back. And so we don't have a formal inventory process of measuring different mammals and bird species. We do these periodic things, and anecdotally, by restoring natural environments, you create the environment for non-plant species like birds and mammals, and etc.
Thank you so much. Thank you in the audience for all these questions. So usually it would be my role as moderator to wrap up the whole discussion. However, I make my life simple and hand this task over to you. So Kahlil and Silvana, so maybe Silvana, you can start. So what are your take-home messages? So could you summarize the most important messages, but also facts you wanted to bring across today?
Well, I think I would reduce it to 2 take-home messages. One is that we need to keep, besides keeping, of course, the fossil fuels in the ground, we need to eliminate any form of emissions from deforestation, from keeping the existing forests in place and avoiding that existing intact landscapes are further degraded. And at the same time, we need to invest in expanding great initiative proofs of concepts like the one we are showcasing today with Kahlil in order to motivate other regions and areas to upscale their ambition. So, and the second one is where you a couple of times mentioned that we cannot, nature-based solution can provide up to a third of our global emission reductions. However, this is only possible if enough climate finance reaches this goal. So in order to reach the Paris Agreement goal, in order to reach the global biodiversity framework, in order to reach the SDGs, which we haven't even mentioned today, we need at least to triple the finance till 2030. So let's do that. Let's invest, let's upscale our ambition.
Perfect. And last time the stage for you, Kahlil.
Yeah, maybe just to summarize, right? Nature and forests specifically are absolutely essential in the fight against climate change. They're absolutely essential for life on Earth. And as Silvana said, that requires money, that requires finance. We need a lot more money going to protecting and restoring nature and forests specifically. Now, when we're going to do that, for this to be successful, we have to think of the land, the people who manage the land, and how does this benefit them? And if people who manage land benefit from having nature on their land, we're going to have a lot more nature in the world, and we all need that.
Super. Thank you so much. Thank you both. Thank you, Silvana. Thank you, Kahlil. From my perspective, this has been a super interesting talk. I personally learned a lot, and I think it was absolutely worth to prolong this cloud talk for, let's say 2 or 3 minutes. Fine. I've also thanked the audience. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your contributions, for your questions, for playing around with the Mentimeter stuff. So I hope you enjoyed this cloud talk. As mentioned before, we do a kind of an after-event communication. We will ask you for your feedback. We will respond on the questions we could not answer here today live on stage. This is a promise. Yeah, and finally, so we will upload this cloud talk on our webpage, www.myclimate.org. So, and I have to, again, thank you. Wish you a great day, especially if you're based in Canada. Wish you a great afternoon, great evening for the listeners here in Switzerland, Germany, or Europe. Thank you so much. Have a great time.